another edition of Creative Corner. This is something that, again, is a project that I'm doing on my own that I thought maybe you might be interested in. Again, it's placemats, but I was thinking about striped fabric on the back of a placemat. Why does it have to be just a simple stripe, up and down or sideways? Why I was thinking about this is that I didn't quite have enough fabric to do all the stripes in the same direction. Some of the placemats would have been sideways and some would have been up and down. So I thought, well, combine them, do the back in kind of a crisscross pattern, and then attach that to the back of the fabric. Well, I've got a nice floral fabric, which is going to be the main front of the placemat. Now, placemats today, they don't have to have batting in them. They can be perfectly flat. You don't have to put a thick batting. You can get some thin batting, a washable felt and put on the inside. Or if you have a really thick count fabric like this one, a really nice heavy fabric, just lining it with a fabric, making sure it stays nice and flat might be nice. If the fabric is too flimsy like this one, you might want to put some interfacing behind it just to give it a little bit more body. But either way, it does need to be lined so that you can get a nice rolled edge and make a nice finished placemat. The best thing when you're working with a big print is to make sure your fabric is nicely centered. If there's a main rose, if there's some grapes, if there's some leaves, at least make sure that all of the pattern design is in the placemat so you don't have half a pattern showing. Specifically if you're working with a pattern that's bordered by stripes. Maybe that's already in the pattern of fabric. Now there's lots of different shapes that you can make. You can make them square, rectangle, oval, triangle, hexagon, whatever shape you want. And then a matching napkin would be really, really nice. This particular shape, or a standard size, when cutting out your fabric, I usually cut out 13 inches by 18, and that roughly gives you a 12-inch by 17-inch finished placemat. So we've got 6 of those cut out. Now, I've got lots of these pieces cut out, and what you need to do, first of all, is sew them together. I've got them cut out larger than they need to be because I'm going to trim it down to the size of the placemat after I have these pieces sewn together. Place them right side together. Make sure that these squares are cut very square with nice straight edges. Or you can simply follow the stripe. Whatever your seam allowance that you pick in the beginning, say a 1/2 inch would be plenty. 5/8 of an inch is standard what you'd use to sew clothing together. 1/2 inch is more than enough whenever you're working with crafts. Don't forget to reverse your stitches in the beginning. And just a 1/2 inch seam. I'm following the stripe to make sure that the stripe, once it's finished and sewn together, it stays perfectly straight. Trying to get some uniformity. Do this to all 4 pieces. And the next 2. The same distance. Whenever you do any basic piecing together or basic quilting, it's a good idea to get the fabric on grain first. But I'm noticing more and more these days that fabric is not made perfectly on the grain. So tearing it and thinking you've got a nice perfect square, well, you really might not. An important step at this point is to iron the seam allowances open flat. Make sure you iron them well and get them perfectly flat, and iron them from both sides. Here we go. And the next one. Here we go. Then you're ready to sew these 2 pieces together. Just make sure that the center, upside down, make sure that the center seam, in other words, the very middle, are together. That's all you have to do. Make sure you're going to sew a nice straight seam. If you have a stripe to follow, perfect. we can trim off the excess after. We'll need to iron this particular join again. A couple layers of fabric. What's important when making placemats is if you use a batting, the batting has to be secured inside the placemat so it can be washable. That is, if you've picked a fabric that's washable. It's also a very important point. When making placemats, don't buy a fabric that's dry clean only. Of course you can. You just have to be dry cleaning it always. A little bit more of a hassle than you need to get into. Now we've got the 4 pieces sewn together. It doesn't matter that they be just a little tiny bit off shape, because this is the very first one we're cutting out. Then we take the actual fabric, place it right on top, and then trim off the excess. This is just the more accurate way of doing it. Whenever you piece together something that's big squares like this, specifically for the first one, kind of tells you exactly how much fabric you're going to need. And away you go. When you look at a fabric like this and you're not sure what color thread to pick, I usually pick the color thread whatever the background is of the fabric. And in this case, it's just a off-white. Trim off a little right here. There we go. Now making sure that the right sides of the fabric are together. I'm going to make a nice square placemat. Place some batting. I usually place the batting next to the layer that's going to be on the top, and that would be the heavier floral fabric. And now sew that all the way around. Whatever side you prefer to keep open, doesn't matter. But you need to keep open at least about 4 inches so you can turn your placemat inside out. We're just using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Keep the needle in the fabric, lift the foot, and turn at the corner. We'll give you a nice, sharp corner. Or at least as sharp as you're going to get with something with batting. Sure the seam allowance stays open as you go over it. The needle down and pivot. Consistent seam allowance is very important. And of course, sewing straight is very important. Consistent seam allowance is important because you're going to make more than one. If they're all cut out the same size in the beginning, and if you use the same seam allowance, well, you can deduct that they should be the same size. Now, once you have it sewn all the way around with a little opening left as well, sometimes the batting stretches just a little bit. Cut off the threads. Trim off the excess. And of course, the first thing to do, as always, whenever making anything square, batting or no batting, trim off corners completely. Now this is perfectly square, so there's no need to trim off the actual seam allowance, but it is important that you trim off the seam allowance of the batting. Gives you a nice flatter side. You don't want to have a bulk up of too much batting along the edges. Prevents your placemat from being perfectly flat then. Kind of curls up at the sides. So trim off as much as the batting outside in the seam allowance as possible. Good way to do that is to fold it back like this and just trim it off. Flush to the seam. And there we go. Some of it tears away if you have the kind that's cotton-based batting. But this is regular quilt batting that if you press it with lots of steam, it'll go nice and flat. If you put it in the dryer, it really washes well. And it'll fluff up a little bit more. And this is just getting hooked in these scissors. Trim it off slowly. Doesn't matter if you cut the batting towards the inside. We're just trimming off the excess, what would have been in the seam allowance. Get this away. Now it's a little bit different if you were making a perfectly round placemat. That's where you'd have to trim off everything because you turn it inside out. Now when we get to the opening, trim it off as if there would be a seam there. Trim off that extra little 1/2 inch. Now you can piece together any fabric. If you don't have a lot of fabric left over from whatever it is you have in your kitchen or family room and you want to make a nice placemat, you can sew together, rather than just stripes, sew different pieces of fabric together. Now, to turn this inside out, you have to roll it at the corners. This is the same as if you were making a baby quilt. Exactly the same. If you were making a baby quilt, the only difference is that it's 1 meter square. Or a meter actually by a yard. What the actual measurement is 40 inches, I think, by 34 or 32. I'm taking it at the corners and rolling it in. That keeps the batting right out to the corners and makes it a little easier to turn it inside out. Reach into the opening when this all comes back in. Reach into the opening and turn it all inside out, like a banana peel. It's just a ball that you turn inside out. Roll that corner, roll this corner, and away you go. Look, it's an alien. It's coming inside out. Now you might want to take a knitting needle or your fingernail and poke out the corners. But we're going to do just a little bit of extra quilting or design to this now after we give it a good steaming. Now when I come back after the break, I'll have this steamed and pressed really nice and flat. I'm going to talk to you about doing some extra quilting on it. So join us right after the break. Hi, welcome back. I'm making a placemat that's got a really nice back. Look at this. Whenever you flip over a floral placemat onto something solid color, well, I think that's kind of boring. When you flip this over, it's really interesting. Kind of crazy on the monitor, but this is really nice. What you should do with the opening, once you press it down like this, is hand stitch that closed. It's the best way to, well, not have any visible stitching lines right there, just to sew it closed. I'm going to now just do a 1/2 inch perimeter of sewing right around the edge, just to help flatten and square the sides. It just gives it a nicer finished look. You can place this stitching line anywhere within a 1/2 inch around the edge. You can even do it 2 inches around the edge. You can do a whole bunch of them and work a 1/2 inch all the way into the center. But quilting is the key to placemats. Actually, I just thought of a different way of doing it. I think I'm going to do 2 rows of stitching. That would look really nice on top of the floral. And I'll show you what I mean when I work around this. So this is just a 1/2 inch away from the edge. And pivot so you get a nice straight seam. When you work with something that is flat and thick and you want to do a bigger stitching line, what you have to do is place something on the machine, which will be your straight line guide, just like the lines that are already there. I'm going to pick a mark that's already on the machine, and that's going to be our guideline. These kind of stripes then would look really nice onto the back. So far, we've just got a flat seam like this. I'm going to pick this screw hole right here where the quilting bar goes in. And so all the way around again. It's a good idea once you have this done to dampen a cotton cloth and give it a good pressing. One more couple of stitches. And check it. Perfect. Give this a good pressing so it's nice and flat, so it doesn't roll up. And let's try it. There we go. And straight down this side. It's very important that you do this good and straight. If you're unsure about doing this straight, you can measure it and place some marks and draw your lines on first to go by. 2 more stitches. There we go. This can also be hand quilted. But a quilted design of anything is much nicer on there. Now you can do the same thing with the oval, but give it a nice flat pressing. And again, I say a pressing cloth would make it much, much nicer. But this is a very, very professional looking placemat, especially when you look at it front on with a nice quilted pattern on it. And again, the quilted pattern is there on the back as well. Not so easily to see because of the stripes, but it certainly makes the front look really, really good now. So again, finishing it up looks really, really nice. I'm going to do the same type of a stitch all the way around the edge of this, about 1 inch away from the sides on this oval placemat. In this case, I'm going to look at it from the back. About 1 inch away from the side. You can do the same thing with the oval. Spread it out a couple of inches in. But I'm going to show you how to use the machine to do a fancier design, like a heart or a star or an initial even. Anything at all. Again, the quilting can be done by hand, but it's so much faster by machine. Hand stitch your opening closed, or use a piece of fusible webbing to iron it permanently closed. Now I'm going to, with a tailor's marker, you might want to iron it first. This will really help you. Fold it in half and give it a little crease. Tells you where the center is. I'm going to now draw a little heart. The trick is to make it the same on both sides. Now if this was a square pattern, a heart in the center and 4 small hearts in the corner would be beautiful. But again, something small like about the size of 1.5 inch square should be done by hand. That is saved for a very experienced seamstress. Start with the needle in and the foot down. I'm going to reduce the stitch length to small. In other words, the lowest number that you have. That helps because the machine then operates much slower on smaller stitches, so you can really maneuver that heart shape a lot better. Start by just reversing a couple of stitches and work around slowly. Just stay on top of the marks that are there. You can do the same thing if you wanted to put initials there. As you can see, a pattern quilted on a solid color is really needed. Not essential for the quilting or the batting, but it's needed for the sake of a solid color is really, really plain. Now again, you can skip this whole idea and not put batting in there. It's very important that you give it a nice, very good, deep steaming. everything good and flat. But this is very inexpensive to get some wonderful placemats. Take a look out there in your craft and sewing supply stores. You'll find lots of different sizes of quilt batting. You'll find lots of different kinds of fabric. You'll find lots of different kinds of knickknacks, specifically a tailor's marker, that if you can see any blue there, you just spray with the damp iron, or the spray of the iron, and iron it, and your marks disappear. It's a water-soluble marker, which makes it really handy to do any freehand quilting. Really quick and easy to do. So any placemat you want to choose, whether it be a solid color or a design like this, they are so easy to do. But again, taking something like this and just doing little teeny tiny stitches by hand, you'll be able to make a placemat in no time. Even if you wanted to sew around the edges with just a hand-stitched darning stitch, you'd be able to do it. Great TV project. Now the only thing that you need for a matching placemat, there's the heart from the front. The only thing you need now is probably napkins. Well, they're even easier to make. The only thing is when you're working with a napkin, yes, that is something that should either be cut perfectly square, and I sometimes use tiles on a floor. That is something that's perfectly square. Use a tile and that could be your template, sort of, except that's only a 12-inch square tile. Napkins are as big as you want them to be. But let me just make a little suggestion on measurement. They should not be smaller than 18 inches. When you buy a fabric and you're sure that it's a fabric that's been made properly, tear it into an 18-inch square. Gives you a nicer, squarer napkin when you're done. Don't include the seam allowance. Always tear that off. You only need to tear off about 1/4 of an inch of it. And now the last one, we'll just give it a little rip. And away you go. Take off all your threads, throw away your excess. You should, if the edges have curled up like this, iron them flat. This is just a broadcloth. It's the best thing for napkins because you wash napkins so often, you want to make sure you get something that's really durable. 100% cotton is no problem as well. But if you're making something with placemats, if you choose 100% cotton for one side, choose 100% cotton broadcloth for the back if you're going to use a solid color. But just remember, whatever the fiber content is, make sure it's all the same in the one project. Don't mix fiber contents. Because cottons naturally react differently to water than something that isn't 100% cotton. The only thing I want to tell you about a placemat that's important is a tiny, tiny rolled edge. And I usually tear it because I find it's much easier to make a seam tiny when you've got something that's on grain. There we go. Start at any corner and I fold down just as smallest amount that you possibly can. A 1/16 of an inch. Basically just the width of the needle. It's very helpful if you have one of those foots that has just one small hole for the needle to go up and down in, because the fabric stays tighter when the needle goes up and down inside there. It's something that takes practice, only because you're maneuvering something very tiny. Don't use pins. Roll it a 3rd time if you can. I usually use my nail to assist in it. I just do a little tiny bit more and show you what this seam is like. You want to make sure that the actual seam stays right in the middle of what you've folded or close to the inside edge. Get it as tiny as possible. We're not actually making a first fold and a second fold. We're actually almost rolling it. Do just one side at a time. I usually do one side and then skip right on over to the opposite. Cut away any if you have too much fraying happening. Teeny tiny, as small as you possibly can. Fold. And the difficult part is it's a tiny, tiny fold that you're sewing, as well as having to stay perfectly straight. Try not to pull the fabric. Again, I've still got the machine on a tiny stitch length, so it makes it a little easier for you to maneuver, and will look a little bit better when it's finished. Remember, broadcloth is a great fabric for napkins because you wash them so often. They can be starched if you happen to fold them into a fancy design. But take that extra time and care to make it really straight, and you'll have some very good looking napkins. Of course, linen, you can use linen for napkins. And a third edge, and then we're done. And that's all there is to it, to a napkin and some placemats. But remember, just to remind you, the approximate size for a napkin is approximately 18 inches. So on the next stormy day or next day, maybe you'd like to give a set of these for Mother's Day or any gift. They're really, really pretty once they're done. Well, thanks for joining us this week on Creative Corner. We'll see you next week.